All right. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Plume Raider, the second in the Backyard Birding Blitz trilogy that began last evening with Chuck Hagner's The Birds of Wisconsin. And we'll wrap up this afternoon with Ethan Bott's I, Robot. Oh, wait, I got that wrong. Did I say robot? I meant Ebird, Ethan Bott's Ebird. That's this afternoon at 3 o'clock today. So I encourage you to hop back on the Zoom at 3 o'clock. See Ethan. He'll give an introduction to Ebird. And whether you're new to Ebird or you're a veteran, I always learn something from Ethan every time he talks about Ebird. In fact, I just talking to Ethan this week, I really learned a lot because I have been afraid of the phone app. I've only been using the computer app, and now it's opened up a whole new world, and we had to do it for the bird walk. So I encourage you to tune in because that will help prepare you for Saturday's Backyard Birding Blitz. The weather's starting to look better, and we challenge you to find as many birds as you can this Saturday morning. You can do this sipping coffee or cocktails from your porch or patio, or you can go out and about in your neighborhood if you're feeling active. We'd love for you to participate in this, or if you're just not into birds this Saturday, you can hop on over to iNaturalist and enter other critters from your backyard into iNaturalist and the Yardversity project. If you have questions about any of this, you can contact Maggie, Ethan, or myself, or you can learn more on the Urban Ecology Center's webpage. I will also quickly mention that most Friday mornings at 9 a.m. on the Zoom channel, we feature the Backyard Naturalist series, which looks at the extraordinary stories that are told by the ordinary species in our backyards, like last week's episode, Full Yellow Jacket. And while we're taking a slight detour from that topic this week, we'll be back again next week with an episode called Monarch NATO. And I hope you can join us for that as well. And today's talk is brought to you by the UEC In My Backyard, a fantastic clearinghouse of activities, videos, and stories related to your backyards or other local green spaces. A few people on this phone call have had some excellent additions, Tori and Kirsten and others. And so visit today and check back a few times every week for new additions. Today, or the featured one today that I encourage you to go watch is called Erin's Fall Garden. And it kind of blew my mind. I didn't even think about planting gardens at this time of year. And you probably remember Erin from such classic films as How to Throw a Moth Party. And now for the feature topic today, which is feathers. We see them all the time. We see them on birds. We see them on the ground. We see them in fashion, in coats. And it's really hard to look at just about any topic related to birds without mentioning feathers. Essentially, feathers are involved in just about every imaginable aspect of bird behavior and bird biology. So I can't think of any talk that I would ever give about birds that wouldn't mention or be somehow related to feathers. So again, if you come across any living animal and that animal has feathers, you know it's a bird because birds are the only living animals with feathers. And I had to say living because there are also plenty of extinct species that had feathers. And these are, of course, the dinosaurs. Dinosaurs were the first animals to evolve feathers. Since birds are the only remaining lineage of the dinosaurs, that's where we go today to find feathers. So if it has feathers, it's a bird or another type of dinosaur. If it doesn't have feathers, it's not a bird or a dinosaur. Pretty simple. The study of feathers has a pretty cool name, and that's plumology. You can also call it plumage science, but that's not as much fun. So one who studies feathers is a plumologist. The word feather has its roots in Old English and in various contexts. The word feather has its origins in the roots of the word meaning down or first beard or stream of smoke or plume. And the first question that we'll explore is, how are feathers different from fur? And the answer is both simple and complex. The easy answer is that mammals grow fur and birds grow feathers. If you go back far enough, there's an ancestral animal that eventually led to both the mammal lineage and the bird lineage that had neither fur nor feathers, but through the intricacies of evolution and natural selection, which have a component of randomness, Mammals evolved a structure called fur for things like warmth and coloration, and birds evolved a structure called feathers for things like warmth and coloration. It is way more complex, and that's what makes it fun. There's things that fur can do that feathers can't, and there's things that feathers can do that fur can't. But in many cases, the function is the same. Let's consider the kiwi. It's a flightless bird, and flight kind of causes feathers to be restricted and to look a certain way. And flight feathers are kind of what we're used to looking at. But if you kind of take away the restrictions of flight, feathers are kind of free to explore other functions more fully. And in the case of the kiwi, feathers start resembling mammal fur. And functionally, kiwi feathers are a lot like mammal fur. And the kiwi holds a niche that is very similar to a bull. They're both kind of scurrying through the underbrush looking for insects. Feathers and fur are both made of keratin, and they both grow out of follicles in the skin, but that's about as close as they are to each other. It kind of diverges after that. So mammal fur and fingernails are made out of a structure called alpha keratin, but bird feathers and reptile scales are made of a structure called beta keratin, not to be confused with beta carotene, which you find in orange fruits and vegetables. So we'll move away from the fur feather comparison and more appropriately towards the scale feather comparison. Feathers are essentially modified scales, and they're much more closely related to reptile scales, which makes sense given that birds today still maintain scales on their feet and legs. And both reptile and bird scales and bird feathers are all made up, as I mentioned, of beta keratin. And secondly, the feather scale comparison makes sense because dinosaurs were more closely related to reptiles than they were to mammals. So the earliest dinosaurs, like this fossilized T-Rex on the upper left, the skin had reptile-like scales, but eventually these scales on dinosaurs became elongated and kind of shredded up for warmth, functioning, again, more like mammal fur does. And then later on, those scales kind of elongated, and you think of a bird feather really as this like elongated, shredded scale. I think I got that right. So they evolved to the point where they could provide lift, which eventually led to flight. And on the lower left, this is an Archaeopteryx, which is widely believed to be the earliest bird. But it's likely that other lines of dinosaurs also evolved flight from their feathers. Here's a depiction of a dinosaur called the Microraptor, not related to the Archaeopteryx, and it had flight feathers on all four limbs rather than just the front limbs. So Microraptor used its front and back legs as wings, we think, in addition to its tail. And this is a line that ended up going extinct, but you can imagine that, through happenstance, if this were the line of dinosaurs that made it through and birds didn't, then more of our birds would look like this than the birds we see today. So current evidence suggests that many, if not most, dinosaurs had some form of feathers, and that a few lines of dinosaurs ended up evolving flight, as I mentioned, but only one line led to the birds, and that's likely the Archaeopteryx line. It's important to note that feathers evolved way before flight in dinosaurs. So essentially some dinosaurs usurped or co-opted feathers for the function of flight later on. So if we look at the structure of a feather, this is a tail feather of a ruffed grouse, kind of the typical feather we're used to seeing. This is also a type of flight feather. It starts with the main shaft in the middle called the rachis, which is attached to the skin of the bird at the calamus. And sometimes the base of feathers can actually penetrate further. There are some bones in birds that have that the feathers are kind of anchored to. But off of the rachis, we have these tiny pieces branching off called barbs. And then branching off the barbs, we have even smaller parts called barbules that are really difficult to see without a microscope or a handy illustration such as this one. So the rachis is like the trunk of a tree, then the barbs are the first to branch off, then the barbs themselves branch off into barbules, and then even the barbules have these tiny buds that branch off called hamuli. And the hamuli at the tip have these tiny hooks that act kind of like a zipper, and each barbule hooks into the surrounding barbules. So if you're holding a feather and you kind of mess it up, you push everything out of the way, you can kind of zip it back into its original shape by running your fingers up the feather, and then the like Velcro or zipper, the barbule hooks kind of go back into place, which is, birds can do this too, but when they do it, we call it grooming. And again, this is just one type of feather. Here's another type of feather called a down or downy feather. This likely resembles the earliest, most primitive feather we found on dinosaurs. And the primary purpose of downy feathers is thermoregulation, usually for warming up. The downy layer is closest to the skin, and it forms air pockets that trap body heat. And this can be very effective if your natural body temperature is close to 104 degrees, which it is in birds. If you think it's hard metabolizing at 98.6 degrees, try adding 6 additional degrees and being able to fly. Then I'll listen to your complaints. Young precocial birds like ducks, geese, sandpipers, and swans are born with downy layers of feathers first, before they grow their other feathers, like body feathers and flight feathers. Downy feathers lack that central rachis, and there are no barbules, only barbs emanating from the calumus. So they're really just that kind of shredded up version of a scale. Incidentally, in 1836, a young man from Seattle almost died of exposure during a hike and said, "Enough with this almost dying of cold." So 8 years later, this man by the name of Edward Bauer, known to his friends as Eddie, patented the down jacket. And down feathers, as I mentioned, whether on a duck or goose or in an Eddie Bauer jacket, are extremely effective at trapping heat, which is why they work so well in coats. So here's an illustration of some of the major different types of feathers. That original feather that we looked at, the flight feathers, you see here the wing and the tail. Then there's the downy feather without much structure, likely evolved for warmth or protection. And then, from that initial design, natural selection kind of MacGyvered into different kinds of feathers with different functions. And that's how evolution works. You can only improve on what you already have. We only started from scratch once. And an example I'd like to give of this kind of MacGyvering and the limitations of natural selection is the human eye. So if you will allow me to digress for a moment, the human eye is a miraculous thing without a doubt. But from an engineering perspective, it's a really poor design. We have this poorly placed optic nerve that affects your vision, you have blind spots. And if you want to look at a really well designed eye, so to speak, you look at the squid and the octopuses. According to Mike Larson, octopuses is the correct plural of octopus. But from an engineering perspective, the squid eye is much more effective than the mammalian eye. But, they worked with what they had, and we as mammals worked with what we had, formed these similar organs, just they kind of function differently. But back to feather types that evolved from the original feather. So we've got the down feather. We briefly mentioned the flight feathers. Then you have body feathers, which are represented here as contour and semi-plume. Filiplumes we'll have to save for Plumology 102. But we will talk a little bit about bristle feathers soon. In fact, really soon. If you look closely at a bird, at certain birds, like when we're banding them, you'll often see these tiny structures that resemble the whiskers of your dog or cat. And those are called bristle feathers. And specifically, these are rictal bristles. They are found usually around the bills of insect eaters like nightjars or flycatchers. And for a long time, we didn't really know the purpose of these feathers. I was taught that they helped funnel insects towards and into the mouth to help birds that are eating insects on the fly. And I've also heard that they do kind of act like whiskers, giving birds another way to sense their surroundings, particularly in low light conditions. But the latest evidence supports that these bristles actually help protect the eyes of birds that are flying around at high speeds trying to catch insects that could go splat on their eye windshields. And, you may look at this bird and think, well, how does that really protect the eye? But it makes more sense when you remember that this is a nightjar, and nightjars are also known as frog mouths. And with their mouths open, you can see that these bristles do really form a nice deflector shield for the eye. In fact, the other place that these bristle feathers are found in birds is around the eye, like eyelashes on this hornbill, further supporting this theory that bristles evolved to protect the avian eye. So that's another function of feathers. And we'll say a few more things about flight feathers before moving on. I do have a separate lecture on the physics of bird flight that I've only so far given in the classroom, but maybe virtually we'll do that soon. But the main thing to know about flight feathers is that they're located on the trailing edges of the wings and the tail. The outer longer feathers on this bird are called primary flight feathers, or in any bird. And the primary function of primary feathers is thrust to produce acceleration speed when they're flying. And then the longer feathers next to the primaries on the inner part of the bird are called secondary flight feathers, and those mainly provide lift. And then you have the long tail feathers called rectrices, which are also considered flight feathers, and they're important in providing stability in flight. Almost all flight feathers are asymmetrical, which allows for differential air pressure on each side of the wing, which is what allows the wing, the feathers, the bird to achieve lift and to fly. More fun to see this beautiful magpie. It does a better job of kind of showing you the flight feathers. And speaking of beauty, sometimes feathers function by not being there. There's a reason. There's a few reasons why birds don't grow feathers in certain areas. So this black vulture has the habit of sticking its head into carcasses and eating flesh and entrails. And so if it had feathers on its head, those feathers would routinely get pretty gross, kind of like when I try to lick an ice cream cone with my beard. So not having feathers on its head is an adaptation of this black vulture. And sometimes not having feathers in certain areas allow for skin colors to come through to make you more attractive to a mate, like in this crane. And in some cases, not having feathers serves both purposes, like with this California condor that eats roadkill, but also wants to show off its beautiful skin. So feathers would just get in the way for a lot of reasons. And, they just tell their barber to take it all off the top. This is by far one of my all-time favorite glamour shots in a bird. With these few exceptions, however, most birds get their color from their feathers, which is another major function of feathers, to provide color. The color in feathers allows for both crypsis, which allows birds to seamlessly blend into their environment, and to make it harder for a predator or a human hunter or human bird watcher to see you. And feathers also allow for extreme conspicuousness that you couldn't really miss if you tried. A common pattern we're familiar with is that in the same species, one sex shows crypsis and one sex shows those bright colors. And sometimes the only way Susie and I are able to identify a female duck is to find out which male it's hanging out with. So this is also fodder for another lecture, but this is a great example of how different species and different sexes within a species face different selection pressures. And selection moves toward both survival, where in this case, the female is selected to survive and is very drab so she can hide from predators while on the nest. And the male's color has been selected through sexual selection or female choice. And oftentimes bright colors are important because they're true indications of a bird's fitness. And a female is looking for the fittest male because she wants the fittest genes to be passed on to her own ducklings. And sometimes these bright colored feathers are an indication of those good genes. There's also a process called runaway sexual selection where females prefer a specific feature, and can be males too. But in like the case of the peacock, the length of the male's tail became attractive, and then the longer tails became more attractive until it kind of gets out of hand. And females prefer this trait that actually hinders flight and makes a male more vulnerable. And so essentially this male is saying, look, I've got this extremely long tail and I'm still alive and functioning, so I must be pretty fit and you should choose me. But it's not only a potential mate, that notices the color of bird, potential rivals are paying attention too. Red-winged blackbird males are kind of sizing up the red patch on other males. And because large, bright patches usually indicate dominance. So if there is a large, bright red patch, another male might say, this is someone I need to pay attention to. So there's this great study, a landmark study, where researchers artificially manipulated the size of the red patch in red-winged blackbirds and found that if they doubled the size of the red patch, more neighboring males saw it as a threat and it got attacked more. But if they shrunk that red patch to make it disappear, or if they completely hid it, then none of its neighbors saw it as a threat, and there were very few aggressive interactions. So plumage can signal your fitness to both potential rivals and potential mates.
Tim, we have a question going back a little bit. Someone's wondering where the dividing line is between the primary and the secondary feathers.
It depends on the bird, how many feathers they have in each tract. But for the most part, you'll see a bend in the wing, and that kind of indicates where the primary and secondary feathers, you kind of have to see below the wing. Oftentimes they'll have slightly different shapes, and it's one of the ways that we can age birds. And incidentally, I'm glad this question came up, because most flight feathers, you'll notice, particularly in the wings, are brown. And the reason we think that they're brown is because one of the pigments, and we'll talk about pigments in a minute, but one of the pigments, melanin, provides a brown color, but it also provides a lot of strength to feathers. And flight feathers, like these primaries and secondaries, get a lot of use. And so if they didn't have that brown pigment, they'd be essentially weaker. And sometimes you can see that within a feather, the parts without brown will actually wear away faster than the parts that do have that brown melanin. And it's for this reason, now this gets kind of crazy, is that we think if you go back to some of the early dinosaurs, there's some strong support that we're always wondering what color feathers dinosaurs had, but those that are studying melanin are pretty sure that a lot of these had this brown color because of the strength of melanin that would help the dinosaurs. So it's pretty fascinating when you look at kind of how all these things are interrelated. Let's see, where was I? Okay, so there are two main ways that we see color in feathers. Most feathers that appear blue, like this bluebird, or they appear purple or iridescent, their color comes from reflecting light that hits the feather. So sunlight has all the colors in it, and then that nanostructure of the feather separates those colors, and the reflected light that bounces off the feather and into your eye is of a specific wavelength or a specific color, in this case blue. And if you want to learn more about this, you can rewatch Starling Wars from season 1, and we talk about iridescence and starlings. You can find that on YouTube. But the other way a feather is bestowed with colors through pigments, and pigments absorb some colors and reflect others, and the colors that they reflect are the ones that we see. So the pigments in this tanager's feathers are reflecting red, but absorbing the other colors. White feathers reflect all of the colors back into your eye, and black feathers absorb almost all of the colors. And again, the color black is really an indication of the absence of color. So black objects absorb almost all the light. And for years, there's been this kind of goal among scientists to produce this blackest black. And they came up with something called Vantablack, that they call Vantablack, which is so black that it completely obscures any relief in a 3D object, and it kind of messes with your perception. It's like looking into a black hole. It's so black, it just makes a laser vanish. It absorbs all of that light. And Vantablack, this is human produced, absorbs 99.96% of all light that hits it. But some birds exhibit something called super black plumage that uses a combination of pigments and structure to absorb 99.95% of all light. So essentially, it's as black as anything that human minds have been able to produce through all of our trials. Another function of bird feathers is actually to produce sound. So the ruffed grouse produces this low drumbeat. Pigeons, when they fly away, actually clap their wings together, and you might just think that's just probably a, that just happens because they're flapping their feathers, but there is likely an advantage to that in kind of announcing their presence and saying, "I see you." And so you may have heard the whistling feathers of woodcock. And so there are many birds that make strange and beautiful and haunting sounds with their feathers, and the internet can be a rabbit hole of really cool videos of looking at how feathers make these mysterious sounds. So there were dozens of awesome videos to choose from to demonstrate this, but I'm going to show you a new favorite of mine that demonstrates bird feather song in the Anna's hummingbird. And this is a really cool, rapid fire photograph of what happens here. And you can actually, if you look at these individual stills, you can kind of see the exact moment that the hummingbird spreads its tail and then kind of puts it back in. So, all right. So I'm going to kind of go into a little more of a rapid fire mode. This lecture could easily go for hours, but I want to pack in some more feather facts before I finish. Some cormorants swallow their own feathers to line their stomach, which protects then the stomach from all the fish barbs that it's eating. And incidentally, in some places, people actually treat and grind up bird feathers to make a kind of protein flour that's actually quite healthy. But normally I don't recommend eating feathers, but apparently you can. I think you have to treat it for pH and some other things, but it's a thing. Ruby-throated hummingbirds sport the fewest number of feathers with 965. Someone actually counted all of the feathers on a tundra swan and came up with 25,216, and 80% of those 25,000 feathers are on the neck. But it's the emperor penguin that wins the contest with about 80,000 feathers, or 60 per square inch. As far as glamour, no group of birds is more exotic, in my opinion, than the birds of paradise of New Guinea. Here's a kingbird of paradise on the left and a king of Saxony bird of paradise on the right. And just to add to that kind of strangeness, there's a specific species of bowerbird. And if you're not familiar with bowerbirds often will, maybe one of the few species, non-human species that we consider makes art. And so they create these elaborate bowers, which serve no other function than to attract mates. And so they build these crazy structures with different colors, and sometimes they'll use they'll look for a specific beetle with a specific color that they'll bring to their bower, or sometimes they'll find things from the human world that will help attract and make their bower more attractive. But there's a specific bowerbird that only looks for these crazy long feathers on this king of Saxony bird of paradise on the right. So you imagine like humans, things that are rare to humans, like diamonds, like when finding something. So just imagine the joy a bowerbird might, have in actually finding one of these, because they're probably very limited. And then they can put that on their bower. They'll have a better chance of finding a mate and being successful. So the bowerbirds are crazy, but then here's a royal flycatcher who probably disagrees with my assessment that the birds of paradise are the most exotic birds. And here's a palm tanager that the palm tanager is among a group of tanagers that have these just crazy plumages. We saw one earlier, and if you've ever been to the tropics, you probably have seen these Tanninger tanagers that are so colorful. And then here's this palm tanager, which, yeah, it's all right. It's pretty cool. But the palm tanager kind of reminds us that beauty is literally in the eye of the beholder, because while we describe this bird as pretty drab, that drabness comes out only through our human eye. So humans have 3 sets of cones to perceive color, the 3 primary colors. So if you want to describe yourself sometime, you can say, hey, I'm an outgoing person. I love reading. I'm about 5'5", and I'm trichromatic, because we have 3 sets of cones in our eyes. But birds are tetrachromatic, meaning that they have 4 sets of cones, and one of those cones allows for ultraviolet. So this palm tanager, it doesn't care that we think is drab, because the color pattern on its feathers can only be seen by other birds that can see in the ultraviolet range. So it's probably pretty attractive if you could see the ultraviolet. I do strongly encourage you to read a book called The Feather Heist. I think Robin Squire recommended to me. And, and maybe there could be a part 2 of this, because, there's so much, there's so much to talk about in the amazing individual control of feather tracks for flight or to warm up. The idea that a bird can fly through the air and then land on a single twig is way more complex than anything humans have produced in terms of aerodynamics and airplanes or rocketry. There's a bird called the sand grouse that actually flies miles away from its nest to absorb water in its feathers, and then it brings that water back to its chicks, and then they essentially kind of suck the water off the feathers as if they're nursing, because it's a desert and it's the only place to get that moisture. But I've decided to end this with a clip that does a really good job of showing several of the things we talked about today. So from feathers producing sound, to feathers having the super black plumage, to this runaway selection idea. And it's a classic clip from one of my favorites, David Attenborough. So let's enjoy this together.
In the great island of New Guinea, there are 42 different species of birds of paradise, each more bizarre than the last. This forest is so rich that nourishing food can be gathered very quickly. That leaves the male six-plumed bird of paradise with time to concentrate on other matters, like tidying up his display area. Everything must be spick and span. All is ready. Very impressive, but no one is watching. The superb bird of paradise calls to attract a female. And he has more luck. But what does he have to do to really impress her?
Those clicks are produced by the feathers. And there's the super black plumage.
she retires to consider her verdict. It's hard not to feel deflated when even your best isn't good enough.
So that's it for today. Thank you for joining, and we hope you enjoyed it and learned something new. And we hope to see you again for a future episode.